Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, the practices of military leaders, all from which I distill lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So this is my way of giving back to all of you, my fellow citizens, who were and continue to be so supportive of the American military, including the time that I was in the United States Navy. So, you spent literally billions of dollars on our training, and so a little ROI for you. How about that? So today I'm going to be talking about the episode is called Deep Lessons, I think, and it harkens back. So in 2012, I had left active duty and come back to Los Angeles, and I went into the Navy Reserves. And toward the very end of the year, I got a call from the commanding officer of what's called the NOSC, Naval Operating Service Center, or something like that. Anyway, it's the place where reservists, all their administrative functions are taken care of. And I had met him a couple of months before. I was around his age, actually a little bit older than him. We hit it off, and he called me up and he said, "Hey, the submarine squadron down at Point Loma is looking for a chaplain. They lost their chaplain over a year ago, and the Navy, the active duty Navy, which is the submarine squadron was a part of the active duty Navy. They haven't been able to send them a new chaplain, and so I thought I'd reach out to you and see if you were interested in helping them out." So now I will say, see, having come from the business world, networking like that was natural to me. Okay, little did I know that freelancing an active duty position was, from the chaplain corps' perspective, verboten. They wanted to control everything. My perspective was, oh, these people need a chaplain, and I told him how that'd be very interesting. I said, my dad was an anti-submarine warfare officer, and he had great respect for the submariners, as he and they called themselves. And so sure, I'd be happy to, if this can be worked out. And in the event, we did, and come, I think it was late February, early March of 2013. I became the chaplain for Submarine 11, Submarine Squadron 11. The Commodore at the time, who's now, I think now he's a Vice Admiral, was Thomas Ishii. The arrangement I worked out was I would be down there during the week, and then on Friday midday I would go home in Los Angeles so I can be with my family, and then on Sunday evening I would drive back down to Point Loma and be with the submarine squadron during the week. And then over the summer, my daughter stayed with me, and she went to a camp in the area. So, and Point Loma is, in my experience, the most beautiful base, the most beautiful naval base in the world, as far as the places I've been. It's very peaceful. It's beautiful. A lot of the base was built a long time ago, so the buildings have that older look and feel to them that I think is just so beautiful. But aside from that, I got to work with these submariners, and they are a unique group in the Navy. First of all, just the entry into the submarine community, you have to be pretty brilliant, is really what it comes down to. So the Navy spends $1 million a piece on the initial training for almost everyone who's going to be on a submarine. Okay, and I'm talking enlisted officer, it doesn't matter, because they have to be nuclear qualified. Okay, which is a very now I was with what were called fast attack boats. These are the small submarines that do things like reconnaissance and that sort of activity, as opposed to the boomers, which are much larger. The boomers are basically like a Navy destroyer that goes under the water, and they carry, at the time I was with the Subron, they carried nuclear warheaded missiles, and then also some ballistic missiles with conventional warheads. So these boomers were enormous compared to the little fast attack boats that comprised my submarine squadron, or the submarine squadron to which I was assigned. And but they all carry a nuclear reactor. And I got to actually go into the nuclear spaces one time. One of the boats, they took me on a tour so I could see what it was all about. It's quite fascinating. I don't know if civilians could ever, I did take civilians on the boat from time to time, including my daughter. I wasn't, I never, I don't think I ever asked them if they can see the nuclear spaces. I assumed the answer would be no. I had a security clearance. I had a secret security clearance. So I think you have to have that to go into the nuclear spaces. But these people are, all of them, very bright. Okay. And I remember one day, so there was one particular sailor that I got to know. He worked in the division, in the squadron headquarters building, which was out on the pier. And he had some medical problems, which is why he wasn't on a boat. And we had gotten to know each other. And one day I was leaving the squadron headquarters building, and I get about, 20, 30 yards down the pier, and I hear him calling after me, Rabs, Rabs. That was my nickname in the Navy, short for Rabbi, Rabs. And so I stopped, and he came running up, and he says, I got to show you something. He was holding his cell phone, and I'm thinking to myself, do I really want to see something on the cell phone of a 20-year-old sailor? I'm thinking probably not, right? But he said, you got to see this. Okay, shipmate, what do you have, right? He said, this is called minute physics. This guy is going to explain the theory of relativity in actually 90 seconds. And he played it for me, right? This is what this young man was watching on his cell phone, right? I mean, kind of remarkable. I don't know too many, young men in their 20s who are watching, physics explanations on their cell phones, right? But this, and he was typical. He was absolutely typical in the sense that he had very profound intellectual interests. He was very smart. He was very motivated. And in his case, he wanted actually to qualify to be a Navy SEAL. I think he had gotten into BUDS once and had not made the cut, but he was looking for an opportunity to maybe do that again. So you can see anyone who aspires to be a Navy SEAL, this is a focused, ambitious, young man. So these were the kind of individuals that I worked with. These were the junior sailors, the senior sailors. So I spent a lot of time with the senior chiefs and the docs, and the doctor in the medical division of the squadron. Got to know them pretty well. These were among the finest chief petty officers that I met in the United States Navy. They were the quintessential chief petty officers. They knew what they were there to do. They were there to build young sailors to take their place, young enlisted sailors to take their place, and they were there to help officers like me you know, learn to be better officers. I remember this was on a Friday afternoon. It was the first time I was going to get underway on a submarine, which I really was looking forward to doing. I was very excited about it. I gave up a weekend with my family in order to get underway. And I was sitting in the medical spaces waiting for it to be time for me to go on the boat. And all of a sudden I started shaking. And I guess my face like went like ghost white. And both of the senior chief petty officers were there, kind of hanging out with me. We were talking, and one of them looked at me and said, "Are you all right there, Rabs?" I said, "Actually, I'm starting to freak out." I said, "I'm a little bit prone to claustrophobia, and the idea of being in a steel tube under the water, it suddenly hit me that, in a couple of hours, that's where I'm going to be. And it's freaking me out." Right. And, honestly, in other contexts, I would have gotten teased, but I'd gotten to know these men well enough, they knew at that point that, you know, perhaps the difference between me, successfully dealing with being on a submarine and not being successful there was in their hands. And they talked to me about it. And one of them even said, he said, "You know what? The first when I was in your place the first time," he said, I honestly I felt the same way." He said it freaked me out, and he said, "But I got on board. I started doing my duty, and next thing I know, I looked at a depth gauge, and we were 40 feet underwater or whatever it was." And he said it he said it'll be okay. Just you know trust me, it'll be okay. But also know that a lot of people go what you're are going go through what you're going through. So there's no shame in being freaked out by what you think is coming up. And sure enough, it was just like what they described. I got on the boat, and I was, I stowed my gear, and I was, hanging out in the ward, what's called the wardroom. That's where the officers eat their meals. And a young sailor walked in, and he saw me there, and he said, I heard we were going to have a rabbi on the boat. Are you him?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Oh, this is so great." He said, I'm Jewish. I never thought I'd get a chance to meet a Jewish chaplain." So um, he took me into the cruise mess, and we sat down and we talked for about 30 minutes. And he said, "So what do you think about being on a submarine?" I said, "Well, I was a little trepidatious, and I'm still kind of freaked out. Like, what is it going to be underwater?" I said, I guess I'll find out at some point." And he said, "Sir, we're underwater right now." I'm like, "Wait, what?" And he showed me the depth gauge and how far down we were. And I'm like, "Oh, well, this isn't so bad." He's like, "Nah, sir, you're fine," kind of thing. So just really, locked in, but just really great people. I'm still friends with one of the independent duty corpsmen that I met on one of the boats, Ernest Chattini. He and I really hit it off. I came from the real estate business, as you know. Ernest at the time was getting more interested in real estate and making real estate investments. So we talked about that, incessantly, and some of the other crew members would come and listen to our conversations, talk about a focused, sailor. Chief petty officer, made it when he was very young, for a chief. And just, man, and sometimes I would just kind of hang out with him, and the younger sailors would come to talk to him because they knew they were going to get good guidance from Chief Shattini. He since is retired from the Navy. Like I said, we still keep in touch, and we're still friends. So my experience with submarines was one of the just most memorable experiences I had, largely because of the people with whom I dealt. They are, like I said at the beginning, just among the finest sailors that you will ever meet. And they it's hard to describe. If we could work with people like them in the civilian world, how fortunate our professional lives would be. Now, by the way, that's not to say that we didn't have problems. We certainly did. There were because most of these sailors are, pardon me, rather nerdish. So they'd get off work, when they were, not at sea. So, the workday started at whatever it was, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, I forget now. It would end around 5, 6 o'clock, whatever it was. And they'd be in their barracks, in the evening, and they would get on in these online video games, and they'd stay up, a handful of them, they would stay up all night playing video games, and then they wouldn't get to work on time. And, day after day, they would be late for work. And we would counsel them, we would work with them, because the Navy had already invested $1 million in these sailors. Like, you're not gonna separate a sailor when that kind of investment has been made. And also the qualification process, there's just not a lot of people who can get through the qualification process, right? So we really worked with them, but in some cases, unfortunately, they did not have the maturity to recognize that that they had to get to work on time. Basically, it sounds so silly to say it. As well, they were oftentimes got relatively large, in some cases very large, signing bonuses, for example, to re-enlist. So I had one sailor who got a $50,000 bonus for re-enlisting, and he promptly went out and bought a high-end Mercedes Benz, spent the entire $50,000 buying this car. Well, then what he realized was the insurance for a Mercedes of that level, I think it was an S class, if memory serves, is very expensive, and he could not afford the insurance on his regular pay. Not to mention, he didn't take into account that $50,000 bonus was taxable. Having spent it all on buying this car, he couldn't pay the income taxes on the bonus, and unfortunately, he ended up having to sell the car. And I'm sure you can appreciate this. Mercedes, they don't hold their value. You drive them off a lot, like many cars, the value drops right away. It was a very sad lesson that he learned in financial responsibility. So, these kinds of things went on too, because a lot of these men were young and inexperienced, never had anything like that kind of money at their disposal. And of course, there were family problems too. It's very hard on families. They would go on a deployment that lasted sometimes 6 months, 9 months, a lot of which they're underwater. So unlike being on a surface vessel, where most of the time you have connectivity with your family, and so whether that's a good or a bad thing, that's a bourbon question. But you have the ability to be in contact with your family, routinely on the aircraft carrier I was on. The sailors could go to the internet cafe and they could Facebook message their family members and friends. On a submarine, especially the boomers as well, but a fast attack boat, you're underwater a lot of the time. And when you're underwater, you're in essentially what amounts to what's called River City. On a surface vessel, River City means that communications off the ship are not allowed except for the most senior officers on the ship, and so it was very hard on families. And I remember doing a reunion brief for wives. It was I think a week or two before their husband's boat was expected back. And I put it together with one of the chief petty officers on the squadron staff. And, the chief and I really kind of told these wives, this is what it's going to be like. Now, for the wives whose whose sailors had, or whose husbands, I mean, had been on deployment before, they're kind of going, yeah, yeah, that's right. They're shaking their heads. Yes, we're watching them. But the younger wives whose husbands, where, their husband was, this was the first deployment while they were married, they freaked out. And I got called in by the deputy commodore, and he's like, what the heck did you tell these sailors? He said, because these wives are freaked out. I'm like, sir, you can talk to chief, such and such. We told them what, in our estimation, they needed to know in order to reunite their families successfully. And he said, well, I don't know, I'm going to have to look into this, but this doesn't sound right to me, chaplain. So shortly after that, I got a call from him. I was in my office. He asked me to come back to his office, and he said, I owe you an apology. I'm like, what do you owe me an apology for? He said, well, he said, I spoke to there was one particular wife who was kind of the head of the wives group, so to speak. And he said, I spoke to her, and she said that you and chief absolutely said what needed to be said, and you did the job that needed to be done, and you did it extremely well. And she said, yeah, young wives new to the Navy, they freak out in the submarine service. That's just how it goes. But you couldn't have done a better job than what you did. And he said, so um, you know I apologize for the way I handled it. I said, hey, look, sir, not to worry. The main thing is that, we're taking care of our sailors. And to his credit, he really appreciated that was that we shared that perspective, is really what it came down to, because that was what our job was on the squadron staff, was to make sure that officers and sailors were taken care of. So these are the kind of things that go on in the submarine community, and you can see that it's a tight knit community, um, where there's very high expectations, but those high expectations are undergirded by a lot of support. Not support in terms of um, uh, making it easier for the sailors, because that's counterproductive in the submarine service, but the kind of support that allows them, or facilitates their excelling. That's really sort of the ethos of the submarine service. And when I would meet submariners in various capacities, so when I was stationed in Germany, our assistant officer in charge was actually a submariner. And he and I got along very well because I knew the submarine community. And so we communicated quite well. And the ethos that I had, that he had from, from being a submariner, um, was very useful for the kind of work we were doing in Germany. I wanted to give you that flavor of what the submarine community is like, because in the Navy, you hear a lot about the Airedales, right? I talk about naval aviation quite often because I spent a lot of time there as well. You hear about the Navy SEALs, which I was also fortunate to spend time with. You don't hear a lot about the surface Navy, the so-called Black Shoe Navy. You don't hear a lot about the Seabees, the construction battalion sailors. And you don't hear a lot about the submariners. What most people's image of Navy submariners comes from World War II movies, Operation Petticoat, kind of on the one end, and, Run Silent, Run Deep on the other end, right? And of course, those movies are not particularly accurate in their day, and they also were filmed at a time when the Navy submarines were, diesel powered. They were much smaller even than the fast attack boats are today, and so they don't present an accurate picture of the submarine service today. But if you ever get an opportunity to tour a submarine, whether it's a small fast attack boat, or whether it's one of the boomers, take it. Just drop everything and go. I think you will be fascinated by it. And one of the best parts about it will be hopefully getting to talk to some of the crew members, and get to know their quality as not just as sailors but as people. So, all right, so that's what this sea service is about. Now, uh, I'm going to talk about probably the most frightening thing that happened to me. I got underway on submarines, I think 3 or 4 times when I was with Subron 11. And most of it was pretty routine. I think in another episode, I talked about doing a burial at sea on a submarine. That was, I mean, burial at sea, of course, is somber, but how some of the things that happened were pretty comical. Smoking cigars with one of the skippers of one of the boats I was on up in the sail was one of the most pleasant experiences I had in the Navy. Um, One of the most frightening things that ever happened to me in the Navy was I was on a boat. We were underway. I was in my rack. That's Navy talk for bed. And all of a sudden, the emergency klaxon goes off, and the executive officer, the XO, comes over what's called the 1MC. That's the internal boat communication system, and he says, we have casualty in I think it was the torpedo room, as I recall now. Fire in the torpedo room. Damage control unit respond. Everyone else stay in place. Do not move. Right. And so I'm lying in my rack in the dark, and I'm thinking to myself, there's a fire on board the submarine, and I'm gonna die. Right? And that's all I'm thinking. Of course, silly. That's not, that was not going to happen, but what did I know? And the damage control unit responded, and within, I mean, it was probably 3 or 4 minutes. It seemed like a long time, like I'm lying there, but I don't think it was more than 3 or 4 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. The XO comes back on, and he says, casualty has been eliminated, secure from from emergency, and you're free to move around the boat again. But in those just few minutes, I was both frightened, but also realized how well trained these sailors were, and how effectively they could respond in an emergency, right? Just minutes to take care of this. That's all it was. And again, that is also part of the ethos of the submarine service. So there's I think I've got I think 6 lessons, is it? Let me see. I'll look at my list here, because as you know, I always make notes. Oh, so I've got a list of 8 thoughts on what we can learn from what's also known as the silent service that we can apply to our businesses. Let's take a break first. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. So this is business lessons from the military, and I'm talking about the lessons that we can learn and apply to our businesses and professional practices from the submarine service, the silent service. So talked about what it was like to be. I was a chaplain on the staff of Submarine Squadron 11, Subron 11, and shared some of those sea stories with you. So let's look at some of the things that we can use for our businesses. So first of all, and I this is I just before the break, I mentioned that the training, for example, that the damage control unit had to respond to an emergency was superb, right? And they were able to take care of that fire on the boat within just minutes, right? So Submarine crews on submarines, they train relentlessly before a crisis in order to be able to effectively handle a crisis. So the lesson here is that we need to prepare our teams for worst case scenarios before they happen, right? So whatever that may be, okay, in our businesses, and we've got to look at our key vulnerabilities, right? We need to prepare our people to deal with them, even though they may never have to, or they may only ever have to once in, 5 years or 10 years or something like that. The issue is when the crisis hits, it's too late to train people to respond to it. Okay. And what we stand to lose if our team is not prepared can be large to existential to our business, right? And so, and if you think about it, on a submarine, what would have happened if that fire had spread, right? And it couldn't be effectively contained very quickly, right? Um, over 100 people trapped in a steel tube underwater, maybe at best having to make an emergency ascent, which is always risky, right? And worst case scenario, the fire takes over the whole boat and kills everyone on board, right? Not an acceptable, event for a submarine and its crew, right? So they have to train to survive. Now, for most of us, our businesses are not existential to the same degree, but the crises that we might face can be very, very serious, right? So we need to build mental muscle memory, if you will, on what to do when whatever bad things might befall our businesses happen. So maybe we're manufacturing a product, and power is lost to our manufacturing facility, right? And now all of a sudden we can't we can't build our product. What are we going to do? And we say, oh, that'll never happen. Well, I don't know. There's everything from discussions about the vulnerability of the electrical grid to things like terrorism, to weather events that can knock out transmission lines, to just somebody does something wrong that causes the power to short out in the facility, and what's going to happen, how quickly can that be repaired, right? So and again, once it happens, now you're going to be scrambling to fix the problem. If you plan for it and even trained for it, so the response is going to be essentially automatic. So maybe the plan is that once it's confirmed that the power is indeed out, and that it's not, there's going to be too long a time gap before it's restored, you're going to bring in generators, or maybe you have generators on site, and they need to be started up so that work can continue. Okay, so how is that all going to work? Do you want to rely on, okay, well, people will figure it out if they need to use these generators? I would think not. I think that would be something you'd want to have your people trained for, and you'd want to have multiple people trained in case whoever is the key generator starter, if you will, is out sick that day, or God forbid was injured or worse, and so is unable to fill that role, right? So where are the key vulnerabilities in our businesses that can have, let's say, a similar effect to a fire on a submarine might have? What are those key vulnerabilities? What is the plan to respond to them? And then how do we train our people so that the response is essentially automatic and we have sound business continuity, right? So train relentlessly before a crisis. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two: everyone must know everything. Now, Another aspect of the ethos of the submarine community is there is a lot of redundancy in terms of the skills of the sailor. So although a particular sailor he may have a rating as a bosun, and another may have a rating as a machinist mate, and another one may have whatever the other ratings they have are. On a submarine where you have a crew of only a little over 100 men, so they need to be interchangeable because you can't carry duplicate, you can't carry 5 bosun's mates or whatever, right? So all of the sailors need to have very flexible skills in order to make sure that if, again, God forbid, there's a casualty on the boat, several sailors are hurt or incapacitated or worse, right? Others can step into those roles. Okay, let's say the submarine has to go into battle. They need to fire torpedoes, right? What happens if the submarine gets hit by some sort of depth charge? By the way, that's still a part of anti-submarine warfare, depth charging. And let's say that depth charge knocks out the torpedo crew, while you still have tubes that are functional, right? So what is the submarine going to do to defend itself? Well, there's got to be other sailors who can step into the breach and continue to fire torpedoes, right? So there has to be cross training. So while it's not literally the case that every submariner can fill every job on the boat, there is a tremendous amount of cross training, and for that matter, cross use. So the table in the wardroom, okay, doubles as a surgical table, okay, and the independent duty corpsman, who's not a doctor, will perform whatever medical procedures are necessary in order to sustain the well-being of the sailors. Okay, and we actually had, while I was on board one of the submarines, we had a sailor fall coming through the hatch, and he hurt his back, and we ended up putting him on the wardroom table and working it out. And then basically we had to work out a time where we could surface. I'm sorry, where we could get, not surface, we were already on the surface, where we could get close enough inshore where we could get one of the boards that you put people with potential back problems on, strap them onto that board and carry them off the submarine, right? And the independent duty corpsman, he was the one handling all of that, right? So in our businesses as well, especially the smaller our business, the more cross training is necessary. Okay, if it's a big huge company with thousands and thousands of workers, so cross training may not be as necessary because we have redundancies. And maybe if we're working, again, if it's a manufacturing facility where there's multiple shifts working, if for some reason a lot of people on one shift are rendered unable to work, so maybe you can call in people from another shift who do the same thing, at least as a temporary temporary measure. But in a small company where you don't have redundancies among your team, so then it will be very beneficial for there to be a pretty high degree of cross training. So people in marketing, they should probably, maybe they work with people in operations or administration, so that if additional support is needed on the marketing side, that's available to them in order to be able to work some kind of new initiative, some kind of product launch or service launch or something like that. So I think it's also, and I talked about cross training in another episode, I think sometime in the last month or so. But when you think about it, it's a great opportunity it's a great opportunity for employee retention, to give them the opportunity to have experiences in departments other than the one that they're assigned to, or that they're working in. And this is good for the morale of your people, right? It also allows them to understand what people, what coworkers in other departments experience, what they go through, so that even if somebody in administration, for example, is not going to actually work in marketing, yet they can be more effective in doing their administrative work if they understand better how the marketing department works, right? So the more cross-trained knowledge your team has, the better in general they can work as a team. Okay, so everyone must know everything, or at least a lot of people should know a lot of what goes on, right? Okay, number three, in the silent service, there's a lot of intentional communication. So you may have noticed watching my shows. I tend to not dangle participles. I tend to not split infinitives. Those kinds of things. I speak a pretty precise variety of English, right? And one of the reasons I do that is I want to be as clearly communicative as possible, right? To leave as little room for misunderstanding as I can. And this is a hallmark of the silent service, where communication needs to be very precise. We're dealing with a highly complex piece of equipment called a submarine with a nuclear reactor on board. There is only the narrowest of tolerances for miscommunication. And so submariners learn to speak clearly, briefly, to the point, and with purpose. Okay. And there's, because there's no room for confusion or ambiguity when you're dealing with a submarine. So I remember when I got to con a boat under instruction, which means I had a chief petty officer standing. Actually, he was over this shoulder, and I was sitting. You have two sailors conning the boat at the same time. You basically do it in unison. So there's a redundancy there. And this was my first time, and it did not occur to me until I sat down and took I don't think it's called a yoke, but it's like the yoke of an airplane, that conning a submarine is most similar to flying a plane, because not only do you move in, left, right, forward, back, but you also move up, down, right? And driving a car is different. You don't have to worry about the car moving up and down. You're on the road. That's it. Same with a surface craft. You're on the surface of the water, bicycle, whatever, walking. When you're in a submarine and an airplane, now you're moving in that third dimension, up and down. And it really takes a lot of training and skill to be able to pilot that boat. But the reason I bring that up is I was in kind of the nerve center for the submarine, and I was surprised by how little communication was going on, but how much information was being conveyed through the limited communication, right? And while I'm sitting there conning the boat and doing my best to keep it level, right? And even the chief behind me, he didn't say a whole lot, right? Only when he thought I was, going to really if I was, that I might really cause a problem, right? Did he intervene? So, and then the instructions he gave me were clear, to the point, and they were intended to get me back on track, and then we moved on with our day. So that's a hallmark of communication on a submarine. And I think I think it's a good idea to foster a similar type of communication in our businesses. Now, we don't necessarily, we don't necessarily want to aspire to the level of brevity that there is on a submarine, where you can be on the um, it's not called the deck. Shoot, I'm going up on the word for where the boat is conned. But you don't necessarily want it to be that silent all the time. There is a reason why on a submarine, sparse communication is practiced, and that's because it's part of the ethos of being quiet, being silent, right? So we don't need to do that necessarily in our businesses, but the striving for clarity I think is the most important part of this idea of intentional communication. So whether we're giving someone, whether it's a supervisor giving instructions to, a coworker, whether it's you know, a, um, a team member reporting to a senior the results of I don't know, the day's work or whatever, or progress on a project, whatever that is. Clarity of communication is important. One of the things about living in the United States is we speak English. English is an enormously rich language, and it has, in some cases, orders of magnitude more words than other languages. So Hebrew has got 20,000 shoreshim, what are called roots in it, from which all the words in Hebrew have to be derived. English, I think, now has something like 1 million words or something. It's a crazy number. So 20,000 versus 1 million, you're talking about what? 5,000 times the number of words, right? Um, we can be very precise with English. English is the language of science in many ways. It took over from German in that respect in the 20th century. And so we should strive for that clarity of communication, take advantage of the richness that English gives us. Okay, so intentional communication. Okay, number 4, trust is built on qualification. So one of the most highly prized qualifications that a sailor can earn in the United States Navy are called the dolphins. Okay, it's the submarine insignia. Okay, and what it means is a sailor who is wearing dolphins, whether he's an enlisted or an officer, he's qualified to stand watch on a submarine, which means he basically has the boat under his charge, obviously subject to the commanding officer. Okay, the skipper, commanding officer, same thing. So I know that one of the issues I dealt with when I was at Subron 11 that was causing a fair amount of heartburn for the Commodore was how could he make coming to the submarine squadron more attractive to chaplains, so they would basically say, I want to go to a submarine squadron. I said, well, one of the ways to do that is to convince Big Navy to allow chaplains to earn the submarine. It's called a warfare pin. Now, somewhat, I think, idiotically, the Navy does not allow chaplains to earn so-called warfare qualifications, with one exception. And so, and this was the basis of my recommendation. So there is a non-weapons version of what's called the FMF pin, the Fleet Marine Force pin, that chaplains can earn. Okay. I once had a Marine Corps colonel offer to give it to me without going through the qualification process because he liked me. We became friends. And I said, I appreciate that, sir, but I think I should earn it. And unfortunately, I never had the time to earn it. And he went on to become a major general. So in retrospect, I think I should have taken it. But in any event, the Marine Corps basically said to Big Navy, we want our chaplains to understand the Marine Corps ethos in depth. And so we're going to create a modified version of the FMF pin. And really the only difference was that that a chaplain didn't have to do the small arms qualifications. That was it. Otherwise, they did all the rest. So what's interesting is on a submarine, there, to the best of my ability, there's no small arms qualification. To the best of my knowledge, there's no small arms qualification for earning the dolphins. right? It's all about understanding how to stand watch on a submarine. And so I thought it would be a possibility, especially given that our Commodore had very high standing with the Navy. And in fact, he was promoted to admiral after he finished his tour at the submarine. And I think there would have been a lot of chaplains that would have come to submarine squadrons in order to be able to earn that pin. I know, to be honest, one of the reasons I floated the idea was because I would have loved to have gotten that pin. So, um, there's a tremendous amount of prestige, and if you see sailors in their khaki uniforms, so they'll be wearing the dolphin pin on their right breast. Typically it's the thing you'll see the highest up on their uniform, basically, and and it you won't see a lot of sailors wearing dolphins. Okay, on my uniform, I'm I think the only chaplain who has the submarine rescue pin. I was allowed to get that, and I did earn it. I'll tell you that story another time. But it's very prestigious to wear certain of these warfare pins, whereas literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of sailors earn the surface warfare pin, and maybe a smaller but still thousands and tens of thousands of sailors earn their air warfare pin. Very relatively few earn the dolphins and other qualifications like the submarine rescue pin, and the special warfare pin, which is what the SEALs get when they finish buds, when they graduate buds, right? So the qualifications are, especially for these other ones, are very rigorous. And I know our chief staff officer, he convinced the Commodore to let him go on board a submarine long enough to qualify for the pin. He didn't make it his first time out. It took him getting underway 3 times, a tremendous amount of study. I think when he first started, he didn't realize how much work it was going to be. But to his credit, Jake, he stuck it out. He got it done. He earned the pin. And I was lucky enough to be FOJ, friend of Jake, and so I sort of, I knew him when he was going through that process. It was a lot of work, especially for someone that didn't come up in the submarine service. So we can create the same kind of qualifications in our companies. Okay. Now these are different. Like for someone who's in, for example, cybersecurity, there's all kinds of qualifications they can get from different cybersecurity training vendors and all this kind of stuff, right? So I'm talking about something different than that. I'm talking about something more along the lines of, for example, when I was a boy, my dad qualified as what's called a professional engineer, a PE. And it was a lot of work. My dad was really proud to have been able to earn that qualification. So, and this was something basically put together by, it was an organization for professionalizing engineering. This was, I think it was in the 1970s, if I remember correctly, that this all came together for my dad. So we can create similar types of qualifications in our companies, and they can challenge our people, but also then give us an opportunity to recognize their advanced abilities by having earned these qualifications. They can also create greater morale and greater loyalty to the company by giving people these kinds of opportunities. Okay, so trust is built on qualification, but the qualifications, they have to be challenging to get. They can't be sort of check in the box kind of things. Okay, next, command by consent, not just rank. So if you're a regular watcher of the show, I use a submarine as an example all the time of because the captain of the boat, who's a commander, an O5 officer, will as readily listen to an idea from his XO, who's an O4, a lieutenant commander, as he will the most junior sailor on board, an E3, like a bosun, just entry level bosun, for example, and that's because the captain of the boat needs to know as much as he possibly can about what's really going on his boat, and in many cases it's the junior people who have that knowledge and can give him the information and the ideas, the suggestions that he needs. Okay, so I won't say it's literally command by consent, because in the end the captain of the boat is responsible for what happens on the boat, but there is a lot more fluid communication process that's unimpeded by rank on a submarine that you would never see. Well, I shouldn't say never, but that you would almost never see, for example, on a surface vessel, uh, whether it's a small boy like a destroyer or a nuclear aircraft carrier. There's just not that fluidity of communication. The only thing, not the only thing, but one of the things that's similar would be an aviation squadron, which I've also talked about before. But it's that level of fluidity of communication that I think is best for our businesses. So we want our frontline people, who are typically the most junior people, to be feeding us their input, their impressions, their ideas. We want them doing that. That can only improve our business. Now, you may say, oh, I can't listen to all those crazy ideas. Really? Okay. How many crazy ideas do you have? Right? And out of 100 ideas that you get from you and your management team, how many of them really turn out to be truly good ideas? I mean, is it really such a massively higher percentage than what you might get from your junior people? I'll be honest with you, I'm skeptical that that's the case. Okay, I mean, unless I guess you're hiring just complete numbskulls as your junior people, and then why are you doing that? Why don't you hire intelligent, junior people who can give you great ideas, okay, things that you can try out, okay, and what could be more motivating for your frontline people that for them to know that, hey, one of our own gave the management team this idea, and the management team's we're gonna try it out. Okay, maybe you're gonna try it out for a week and just see what happens. You're gonna try it out for 2 weeks or a month or whatever it is. Okay, gosh, to me, that sounds like a huge morale booster. And again, getting the information from the people closest to the problem, getting the solution from the people closest to the problem, it's got to be more effective than what we cook up. No matter how much we know about the front lines, we don't know everything, right? Okay, let's see. Okay, I'm going to talk about one more. I have 8, but I'm going to talk about one more, and that is surface regularly to check reality. So I was having this discussion with my friend Michael. Again, those of you who are regular watchers of the show, we have an every Monday evening call where we talk for anywhere from an hour to sometimes 2.5 hours. And we were talking about this idea of reality. It seems like reality has gotten more subjective, maybe especially post COVID. But the reality is, right? Reality exists. What's subjective is how we perceive reality. Okay, and for a submarine's crew, one of the key aspects to running that boat effectively is that they have a uh, a unified perception of reality, I guess is the best way to put it, and that requires periodic reality checks, right? So this is part of the training. It's part of the philosophy, the ethos of the submarine service, right? And one of the ways that it's achieved is by, um, in essence, taking a mental, if not an actual step back to get the larger picture. Or on a submarine, if it's submerged, to, you know, bring up that periscope and look around and see what's really going on. One of the things that I find most kind of freaky about being on a submarine is there, you're not able to look outside the boat. So unless it's on the surface and you have permission to go into the sail or on the deck for some reason, and there is, and it's not, there has to be a good reason. Sailors just don't go and do it for, when they want to. You're inside that tube, right? And it's very easy to lose your bearings and lose your sense of reality in some ways, right? So you need to get outside the boat, or at least, look through the periscope to get yourself sort of realigned, right? So we need to do that with our businesses as well. This is why, historically businesses had retreats to kind of get out of the office, get in an unfamiliar environment, and kind of look at the business from a different perspective. We need to do that for all our people, not just the senior management team, right? We need to be able to give our people the opportunity to get perspective on our business so they can get fresh ideas, new approaches to handling the business, whether it's sales, marketing, admin, operations, whatever it is. We want our people being able to stand back, assess broadly, and then move back in to get into the specifics again. And so we want to build that into how our businesses operate so that we can do these reality assessments on a periodic basis. So those are I think the key lessons that can be learned from being on a submarine, from how the silent service works. Be interested, as always, to hear your thoughts, your comments, your criticisms. All the links to my social media will be in the show notes when this episode posts on YouTube, as well as my email address is there as well. So let's see. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. All the times, of course, are Pacific time. And then a week from today, I'll be back for the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So I thank you very much for joining me today. Got some live viewers on deck, and always good to know that. Thank you so much. If you like the show, if you found it interesting, share it with a colleague, someone who's in business maybe, or I'd really appreciate that. I'd like to spread the word, trying to help as many people as I possibly can. So would really appreciate if you'd pass it on to them. So once again, thank you so much for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my bell. Courage at all times, my friends.